Hello, class is Mr. Mormon, and this is your review for the ecology test. Let's start with the definition of ecology. It's all about connections between the living things and the non-living things that surround them. Another concept you need to understand is levels of organization. In this diagram here you see an individual, which is one member of a population or a species. A community is all of the populations living in an area. If you include all the abiotic factors, you then have the ecosystem. A biome is a region of similar climate and weather, same dominant animal and plant species. This would be like a rainforest or a desert are examples of biomes. Put it all together and you have the biosphere. Many students have trouble discerning between community and ecosystem. Again, community is all the different populations, all the biotic factors. An ecosystem would include the abiotic factors as well. Can you define adaptation? Adaptation is the physical features or behaviors of an organism that helps it to survive. Next, we're going to talk about how energy flows through an ecosystem. It starts with autotrophs. They're either photosynthetic or chemosynthetic. Photosynthetic organisms are using sunlight to make food. Chemosynthetic organisms use inorganic compounds. You need to be able to answer these questions about photosynthesis. What is the purpose or function of photosynthesis? It stores sunlight energy in the chemical bonds of glucose. They are making their own food. Raw materials, carbon dioxide and water. The whole chemical formula looks like that. Can you define autotroph and heterotroph? Do you know what the different types of heterotrophs are? Can you define them? Do you know the two functions of food? Gives us energy, that would be carbohydrates, starches, sugars, and it gives us the building blocks so that we can build our own molecules through amino acids and proteins. Do you know what food chains and food webs are? Food chain is one line showing the energy coming from the sun through the producers and all the consumers to the decomposers. A food web is showing many, many different food chains. Do you know what the arrows represent? They represent that flow of energy. Trophic levels. These are the feeding levels or steps in a food chain or food web. We use ecological pyramids to show that as you move up the trophic levels in a food chain, the energy, the biomass, and the numbers all decrease. Energy gets used up in an ecosystem. Most of it is used by the organisms, but some of it is lost as heat. Now let's talk about cycles of matter. How is the way matter moves through an ecosystem different than the way energy moves through an ecosystem? Unlike the one-way flow of energy, matter is recycled within and between ecosystems. Here we see the carbon cycle. Remember, energy gets used up, but matter, like these atoms of carbon, just move around the ecosystem. They do not get used up. The point is the carbon is never destroyed. Unlike the energy that gets used up, the carbon atoms just move around from one place to another in the ecosystem. Here you see the water cycle, another example of matter just moving around to different places in the ecosystem. Here we can see how nitrogen cycles through the ecosystem. Sometimes in the atmosphere, sometimes in the ground, sometimes in water, and sometimes in the living things. Now it's interesting, even though plants and animals are surrounded by this nitrogen gas, it can't be used. It has to be fixed by nitrogen fixation into the solid molecules of ammonia, nitrates, and nitrite, like we see here. This is very often accomplished by bacteria living in the soil or on the roots of plants. The phosphorus cycle is a little bit different because phosphorus cannot be a gas. You'd never find it in the atmosphere. The nutrient labels that are on food or on fertilizer labels tell you the essential nutrients that are found in that food or fertilizer. The numbers on a fertilizer label tell you the percentage of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, N, P, and K, that are found in that fertilizer. These are in percentages. We also learned about eutrophication. Eutrophication starts with nitrogen or phosphorus pollution into an aquatic ecosystem. The sources, as you can see here, are fertilizers and sewage and other industrial sources. Stormwater runoff and fertilizer from golf courses, lawns, and farms play a big role in putting that nitrogen and phosphorus into the water. The effects, the nitrogen causes algae blooms because it's a fertilizer. Algae, which is a plant, goes crazy. The extra algae dies, sinks to the bottom. Decomposing bacteria use up a lot of the oxygen as they break down the dead algae. Of course, when all the oxygen's gone, the results are going to be a lot of dead fish. So again, nitrogen pollution leads to algae blooms. The algae dies. Decomposers use up the oxygen, and that leads to a lot of dead fish. You should know what limiting nutrients are. This is when a single nutrient that is either scarce or it cycles very slowly through the ecosystem limits how large a population can grow. Okay, let's move on to how climate and weather impacts an ecosystem. First of all, do you know the difference between weather and climate? Weather is the day-to-day conditions in an area. Climate is the average of the weather over the year. These are the things that we learned at the climate station in our ecology discovery stations. It all starts with the unequal heating of Earth's surface, like this diagram is showing, the equator being heated more than the poles. You then have convection, hot air rising, cool air coming to take its place. This is what causes all of the global winds. Coriolis effect bends those global winds into different bands. The band that is over us is called the prevailing westerlies. The band that's right over the equator, or the area right over the equator where there's often very low winds or no winds at all, is called the doldrums. Some of the different main climate zones on Earth are the tropicals near the equator. The temperate would be the zone that's over us, and then the polar zones in the north and south poles. You need to understand the greenhouse effect. Ultraviolet radiation passes right through the glass of the greenhouse or the atmosphere very easily. It gets turned into infrared or heat energy, which then gets trapped. It's carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas that's trapping all that heat. So why are scientists worried about all the extra carbon dioxide we're putting in the atmosphere? It's because it's leading to increased global warming caused by the greenhouse effect. Community interactions. You need to understand biotic are living things, abiotic are non-living things. You need to know the difference between a habitat and a niche. A niche is how an organism fits into the ecosystem. It's the organism's role. Habitat is where the organism lives. So an organism's habitat would be part of its niche. But the niche would also include what the organism eats, where it makes its nest, when it hunts, when it sleeps, if it hibernates, everything would be the organism's niche. Habitat is just where it lives. All right, some other community interactions. Competition, predation, symbiosis. Can you define them? There's three different kinds of symbiosis. Do you know what they are? Can you define them? Mutualism is where they both benefit. Commensalism, one benefits and the other is unaffected. In parasitism, one benefits, the parasite lives on or inside the host, and the host is harmed. These three species of warbler decrease their competition by each specializing and living in a different part of the tree. Here are some examples of symbiosis from the book. Mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. That's a flea on the bottom there. All right, succession. Primary succession versus secondary succession. First of all, succession is the gradual change in an ecosystem where one community replaces another over time. Primary succession, you're starting with just bare rock. It's the first succession that happens in an ecosystem. The plants themselves start to create the soil, which allows new types of plants to take their place. Secondary succession is when you have an established ecosystem that is then damaged by a natural or man-made disaster and has to be rebuilt. Pioneer species are the first species to colonize an area. Those would be the lichens and mosses that can grow right on the rocks. The climax community is what you get at the end. On land, it's usually going to be some kind of forest. This is an example of succession as well. This pond is slowly filling in over time, sediment is building up, and the community changes. Okay, let's talk about succession. It's the gradual change in an ecosystem over time where one community replaces another. Primary succession is where you're starting with just bare rock. The pioneer species, like lichens and mosses, can grow right on the rock. They then start to create the soil. With soil come other species that can, like the grasses would come next, and then plants, small bushes, and trees. Secondary succession is where you already have an ecosystem that then gets destroyed or damaged by either natural or man-made disasters and takes a few steps back and has to be rebuilt. Pioneer species are the first species to colonize an area. Those would be your lichens and mosses. The climax community is the community that you end up with in the end. On land ecosystems, that's usually going to be a forest. Now, you can't start out with the trees because there's no soil. Again, the plants help to create the soil, which is what drives the succession. Here's another example of succession where a pond slowly fills in with sediments over time. One community replaces another as this ecosystem changes. Now let's talk about the biomes of Earth. What factors determine and influence Earth's biomes? In other words, why are some areas a desert and some areas are tundra or rainforest? It's all about climate. We studied all the different biomes of Earth with a map that looked like this. Populations. Which factors influence a population's size, which increase and decrease a population? Well, births and immigration will make a population grow up or increase. Deaths and emigration will make a population go down. You need to know the difference between exponential and logistic growth. With exponential growth, the rate just keeps increasing. Okay, both these graphs are going up, but with an exponential growth, it's getting steeper and steeper and steeper if you look at the slope. Carrying capacity and limiting factors. Carrying capacity would be this area on the graph here, showing that the population is not getting any bigger. The limiting factors would be the things that are keeping the population from growing any higher. Usually it's the amount of available food. Can you describe human population growth? This looks pretty exponential to me, kind of scary. We're over 7 billion people at this point. We learned a lot about humans' impacts on the ecosystem. This video will be going more into that. The more people you have, the more you have these human impacts on ecosystems. Okay, aquatic ecosystems. What factors govern aquatic ecosystems? That would be depth, flow, temperature, and chemistry of the water. What is an estuary? This is a place where the fresh water meets the salt water. They are the nurseries of the seas and are very important. We need to conserve them. Photic zone and aphotic zone. Photic zone is the area at the top which gets light deeper than 200 meters. That's the aphotic zone and receives no sunlight. You're not going to find plants down there or algae. Plankton, there's two different types, phytoplankton and zooplankton. Phytoplankton is the plant-like. They are autotrophs, making their own food from sunlight, and the zooplankton are animal-like. They are going to be eating the phytoplankton. All right, biodiversity. You need to understand biodiversity is a very good thing. It's the sum total of all the genetically based variety of all organisms in the biosphere. It's one of Earth's greatest natural resources. Species of many different kinds have provided us with foods, industrial products, and medicines, including painkillers, antibiotics, heart drugs, antidepressants, and anti-cancer drugs. Ecosystems with high biodiversity are more stable. Biodiversity should be preserved, especially in rainforests, for the yet undiscovered products and medicines they may contain. And many human activities threaten biodiversity. We're going to talk about these next. Pollution, introduction of invasive species, habitat destruction, over-harvesting. All right, human impacts. Pollutions. A pollutant is a toxin. It's a harmful material released into the environment. Many pollutants can be biologically magnified as they travel up the food chain. You need to understand biological magnification. As certain toxins like DDT move up the food chain, they become more and more concentrated. Oil spills, another example of human pollution, as is smog. Acid rain. Now there's three problems that you need to make sure that you know. Acid rain, ozone depletion, and global warming. They're all caused by air pollution, but you need to understand the specific differences between them. Acid rain is from burning fossil fuels. Nitrogen and sulfur dioxide go into the air. They combine with water and form weak acids. This is very damaging to forests, and it can also acidify lakes, killing sensitive fish like trout. Ozone depletion is caused by chlorofluorocarbons. These are chemicals that used to be used in refrigerants, and they were also used as propellants in aerosol cans. Chlorofluorocarbons destroy the ozone layer in the upper atmosphere. This has led to a hole in the ozone layer in the 1990s. Since then, we've outlawed the use of CFCs in the United States, and the ozone layer has been repairing itself. The chlorine from the chlorofluorocarbons, the concentration is less and less and less because of this ban, and the ozone hole is patching itself. All right, the greenhouse effect and global warming. Carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are released into the atmosphere from fossil fuels burned in automobiles, power plants, factories. This greenhouse gas, the carbon dioxide, allows sunlight to pass through, but it traps the heat energy, just like the glass in a greenhouse. Increased greenhouse effect may raise global temperatures, affecting climates and harming ecosystems. Here's a diagram showing how this works. The ultraviolet radiation goes right through. The infrared heat energy gets trapped. The effects. The carbon dioxide emissions increase the greenhouse effect and may contribute to global warming, changing global weather patterns and harming ecosystems. Here you see this diagram is showing how the polar ice caps are melting. This is leading to sea level rise. This is a summary of the causes and effects of acid rain, ozone depletion, and global warming. You need to understand that they're all caused by air pollution, but a different kind of air pollution. Introduced species. One of the most important threats to biodiversity are introduced invasive species. Invasive species reproduce quickly because the new habitat does not have the parasites or predators to control their population. They then outcompete local species. Land use decisions, resource acquisition, things like soil erosion and desertification, deforestation, habitat destruction, strip mining, overharvesting, urban sprawl. These can all have severe impacts on ecosystems. You need to know the difference between renewable and non-renewable resources. Could you tell which of these are renewable? Sustainable use and conservation. Sustainable use is a way of using natural resources at a rate that does not deplete them. Sustainable farming would include practices like crop rotation. Crops that are demanding on the soil's nutrients are rotated with crops like legumes, those are like beans, for example, that replenish the soil. In order to conserve wild animals and fish populations, governments impose hunting and fishing regulations or limits. That's all part of conservation. Aquaculture would be another example of a sustainable type of agriculture. This is where you're raising fish on fish farms so that you're not taking them from the wild. Okay, that's it for this video. I know I covered a lot and I went very quickly, but there was a lot of material we did. Good luck on your test tomorrow, and we'll see you in school.